My friend had at work a father-daughter day, bring your daughter to work, and he had a 7-year-old. And the 7-year-old, second grade is probably the best, my favorite when raising kids. And so he took her and they did an amazing thing. The boss had all this stuff set up and so they were getting tours of the different places to go and what the different people did. They went to the factory, they went to the offices. They had the donut break, which the girls loved. And when it came time for lunch, they were going to feed the kids the lunch. And all the workers were there. And the boss had a microphone, and he had the girls come up on stage. And he was asking the girls what they enjoyed about the father-daughter day. And all of them were on the mic and talking about it. But my friend's daughter had said nothing so far. And so the boss went down to her and said, "Now, did you have any surprises today at work?" And he put the mic down, and she looked up, and she said, "Well, yes, I did." And he said, "Well, what surprises did you have?" He says, "Well, I didn't see any clowns. I thought my dad worked at the circus." And the boss said, "Well, what made you think that?" I said, "Well, all the time he says he works with a bunch of clowns, and I didn't see any." Today's message is In My Spheres of Influence, and we're going to speak about career or your work world. We are going through our life vision statement, by God's grace to step forward as God's man or woman in my spheres of influence. We're going to camp here for a few weeks to serve his purposes for his glory. When I think about work and having an influence at work, I don't think so much about, being an evangelist at work or having your Bible at your desk. And, some places that's a no-no, and some places you can do that. But really, when the Bible talks about this, the kind of influence, it's influence through why we work and how we work. When I was in grad school at the seminary, I had a summer job at Ward's Warehouse, and it's hot in Fort Worth, Texas. And my job, along with two black guys, we became very good friends. Our job was to unload trucks that had come in overnight, all the boxes, washers, dryers, refrigerators, freezers, furniture, unload all these boxes and then take them to their spots in the warehouse. And then we were to load trucks for the orders that had come in overnight and to people that wanted stuff. And this truck is going to go to North Fort Worth and East Fort Worth, that kind of thing. Well, we had opportunities, sort of downtimes between either or loading trucks. And so the first week I went to my boss and I said, "Hey," I said, "I like my job. I like the loading and unloading trucks. I like my guys working with. But we have downtime. And so I would like to ask you if you would put together a list of 10 things here at the warehouse that need to be done, but nobody really wants to do them." And he looked at me like I was speaking French or something. He was just dumbfounded by this. And he said, "Okay." And so the next day when I came in, I said, "Do you have a list?" And he said, and he had a list. Well, the number one thing on that list was, I did not know, so there was a second warehouse there, right next door. And that warehouse was rarely used. And when I went over there, it was dusty, dirty, cobwebby, wondering kind of when was the last time anybody was in here. And number one on the list was clean the second warehouse. And so during breaks between loading or unloading trucks, I would take my big broom, my push broom, and some trash bags, and sometimes I would get the mop and the bucket with water in it, and just little by little work my way through that second warehouse cleaning. Now, I don't remember if I got done or not, and I don't remember if I got all the things on the list done. All I remember really was just this massive amount of work that needed to be done to clean up this warehouse. But that had an effect. Apparently, no other people had so far signed up for something like that. And my boss was pretty blown away, as was the two friends I worked with. Now, I was able to have some influence, not just in what I was doing in terms of cleaning the warehouse, but why I was cleaning the warehouse and how I was cleaning the warehouse, my attitude in that. That had an effect. That had influence. And that's what we're talking about here. as we look into my spheres of influence are basically wherever you go and there are people. And particularly, this is truer when you are at repetitive places. So in your handout, have marriage. Well, obviously, your spouse is a sphere of influence. But I also mean sometimes you have married friends. And you do things together. And so I would include some of those people there. As we're going through this list, what I'd ask you to do is think about who are people, names, first names, that you can jot down in your spheres of influence. So the realm of your married life and married friends. The second one is family, and that's more than just your kids, but your friends' kids and your friends' families that you hang out with and do stuff. Extended family, this may be the most difficult one. It involves what I think of as in-laws and outlaws. Your career, which we're going to talk about today, and that includes your boss, it includes your peers, and it includes people that work for you. But it also includes people like vendors or salesmen that come in periodically, and you have a chance to get to know their name and to get to know something about them. Your neighbors, that's the people that live around you, or people that used to live around you that you still have contact with. The community, and here, for me, this means I think about the stores or the shops that I go or the restaurants that I frequent. And I like to meet and know the people that work there, whether it's the wait staff at particular restaurants or the clerks at stores or shops. But this can also include when I was coaching Little League Baseball or girls soccer for 16 years. That's the community relationships that you're building. You have a chance to influence. Church, this is people in our church. Maybe you don't see that often, or people you'd like to build relationships with. And then I have school, both as a student or as a parent. So if you're a student, this is your teachers, your fellow students, coaches, admin people, or school as a parent. This is the involvement that you have at the school with your kids there, like PTA would be an example of this. So what we're going to do is think about career. Now, when you think about influence, what I'd like you to do is just put your thinking cap on and think about, up until this point in your life, who has had influence in your life? There's probably a name that comes to mind, a couple of names, a face, maybe a couple of faces. This could be somebody when you were in school, somebody at work, somebody at church, can be a relative, a coach. Who is somebody that comes to my mind? And what did they do to provide that kind of influence? How did influence take place? How did they relate to you? How did they talk to you? What's something that grabbed your attention about this particular person? Influence is simply having an effect on somebody else. It can be a great effect. It can be a small effect. But you see it in effects in your life, something that changes, something that's important to you or how you relate, or even like the course of your life, changing course. Most of the time, influence happens in very small ways. Very small ways, almost subtle, but just little nudges. And I have in your handout 5 things that I think are sort of I'm not talking about professional influence. This is personal influence. And I think about just taking an interest. That's the one I hear the most from people when they talk about people who had influence in their life. Somebody took an interest in me. Or I think about somebody cared about me. Third one is there's something about that person's character that got my attention, won my respect. Courage is a fourth one, and then example. Now let's dive into your work world. When the Bible talks about work matters. Your work is just as important to God as my work. There's no drop off between what I do and what you do from God's point of view in your work world. That's how the Bible looks at work. It is just as important. It matters. It also helps provide for your family's needs. It provides opportunities to give beyond your family. And it also has a chance to influence people in the work world and through your work world by what the company does. All of these things matter to God. Let's look at two particular passages in the New Testament. And the odd thing about this passage is that it relates to slaves and masters. Slavery's been a part of human history almost from the beginning. And in the New Testament times, when the New Testament was written, that was certainly true in the Greco-Roman world. And so as people became Christians, some of them were slaves. Paul was giving them instruction as how to live. And he was giving instructions to, if you had slaves, how are you to treat them? Some slave relationships were bonded relationships, like over 7 years. We had a number of people that came to America as indentured servants. That would be an example here. But what's interesting to me about these two passages we're going to look at is that there is a parallel between what he tells slaves to do and why they work and how they work, and good advice if you are an employee in how to work and why work. And when he talks to masters, there's also a parallel that's interesting about if you are the boss or the CEO or the owner of a company, how you are expected to treat employees. So let's look at this in Colossians 3:22. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs, and there is no favoritism. Now, this is good advice for slaves, but it's also good advice when I was on staff at our church in Fort Worth that we helped start. As an employee, this was good advice for me. Slaves, employees, obey the boss. The boss is the boss. And if you don't like your boss and you don't want to follow the boss, that's up to you. You can find another boss. But as long as you are working for that company, it's incumbent upon us to figure out how to do what the boss wants us to do. Not only when their eye is on you and to curry their favor, and then he amps this up, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. This is shocking. But what he's talking about is if your motivation, for the most part, relies on your boss's ability to motivate you or to provide an example, you are hanging on by a thread sometimes. There are big things he's saying about why we should work and how we should work. Sincerity of heart with reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, whatever the job is, cleaning out a cobwebby, dusty, dirty, filthy warehouse. Do it, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart and that is one of the great words in this passage, as. He does tell us to work not just when the boss is looking, when he's not looking, but I love this word as. Work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord and not for human masters. This affects how we work and why we work. Since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. We all enjoy a paycheck. That's good. But there's something bigger coming down the road. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for their wrongs. There is no favoritism. Now, it's so stunning to me that in just these few little verses, there's specificity about how we work. But the why we work is the big thing here. And 5 times in these little verses, he mentions the word, 4 times he mentions the word Lord, and 1 time he mentions the Lord Christ. 5 times in 4 verses, he is telling these folks, this is why we work. This is how you motivate yourself with work. Now, in our particular culture, sometimes the younger folks, the Gen Zers, I guess they're called, or Gen Xers, I always get mixed up here. But the young people in general really get kind of they get thrown under the bus as a whole thing. And I'm not in that category. But I was reminded of a story of a father-in-law who just had a son. Their daughter got married, and he was a very wealthy businessman. And he went to his new son-in-law and he said, I'd like to make you a half partner with me, 50-50 partner with me. We're thrilled that you're in the family, and this is just great. We think the world of you. And he said, but you have to do one thing. He said, you have to come to work every day, go to the factory, and I want you in the factory to learn how all the systems in that factory work. Seemed like a good, reasonable expectation. And the son-in-law says, I can't do that. He said, well, why? He said, I hate factories. I hate these busy, noisy, loud. I don't want to do that. And the father-in-law was sort of like, I can't believe you just said that. And so he sort of retreated and he said, okay, well, I'll tell you what instead. I want you to come to the office complex. And I want you to every day show up at the office and just observe what all of the different people are doing and the organization of the people and how this all works. The son-in-law said, I can't do that either. I hate office work. I cannot imagine being stuck in an office 40 or 50 hours a week. I can't do that. And now the father-in-law was a little bit ticked at his son-in-law. He said, do you hear what I've just said? I've offered you half of the company as a partner along with me. And you're not willing to go to the factory or learn about office? He said, and the kid said, no. And the father said, well, what in the world can I do? He said, well, you could offer to buy me out. There's a little bit too much there in the workplace there. Well, Paul, after he talks to slaves, says in chapter 4, verse 1, masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. And the idea here is that not only do you need to do right, but someday you're going to have to check in up the line with somebody who you're going to have to report to. And they're going to know everything that you're doing. Well, the same thing is true in Ephesians 6. You see the same parallel. Chapter 6, verse 5. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. Serve wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one of you for whatever good you do, whether they are slave or free. That sounds a whole lot like what he wrote in Colossians, doesn't it? There's a lot of parallels here. Again, on one hand, there's the obey your masters. He's the boss. That's your job, is to do what the boss wants you to do with respect, respectfully, and with fear and sincerity of heart. My favorite words in this are little bitty phrases. Just as is the first one, as you would obey Christ. And then a little bit farther down, obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as, just like the other passage, as if you were serving the Lord, as slaves of Christ, and then again, as if you were serving the Lord. In other words, he's saying you have got to reframe how you think about work. You're not just working for this stupid boss or this lame boss or this boss that doesn't know what he's doing. That may be the case. But you have a much higher boss that you're supposed to be working for and can work for. And then, I like this word heart is mentioned 3 times in this little passage. With sincerity of heart, doing the will of God from your heart, serve wholeheartedly. Again, he's talking about how we work, and we are to engage ourselves fully in what we're doing. And just like the passage in Colossians, he mentions the words Christ. A second time Christ, he mentions the word God, and he uses the phrase the Lord twice, 5 times in these little verses. Again, to lift up our eyes to see that what we're doing is more than just clocking in, clocking out, getting our paycheck, and trying to put up with the boss. Same thing happens, same parallel in verse 9. Masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven. The same parallel. You may wonder if your boss gets away with murder. Well, one day he's not. And at that point, he's going to really regret that he got away with murder. This master is in heaven, and there's no favoritism in him. And in this one verse, God is mentioned twice as he, him, master, and his location in heaven. Now, I know about one boss that was really irritated at work, and because he just seemed to have no influence with the employees. And it just drove him crazy. He tried everything to try to motivate these people, and nobody took him seriously. So one day, he made this huge sign, and he taped it to his door that said, "I am the boss." And he left for lunch. And when he came back from lunch, the sign was missing. And that irritated him all the more. It illustrated exactly what he was. Nobody was taking him seriously. And some guy was walking through and he said, "Hey, do you know what happened to my sign?" The guy kind of swallowed and said, "Well, your wife came. She wanted her sign back." Now, from these two passages, how you work matters. How you work has influence, whether you're aware of it or not. Influence is happening in your attitudes, the quality of your work, throwing yourself into it, doing it the best you can. In my opinion, I think in your handout, our influence in the workplace comes through how we work, the boss-employee relationship, and peers, and why we work. Each of these three Paul deals with in these two passages, and that's how influence happens at work. Now, I'd like to do a little case study here on the back of your handout. When I think about the prototype for working in awful conditions and where you have every reason to just check out and just do the least amount, I think about Joseph in the Old Testament. Now, Joseph was that annoying little brother that none of the older brothers liked. And he sort of had something like this coming, although not to the extent. They took him out and they threw him down a well and went back and told their father that he'd gotten killed. As a passing caravan came back, the brothers said, "Hey, we can make some money off Joseph." They pulled him up out of the well. They sold him into slavery. Off to Egypt, they take Joseph, and he's sold to a named, I don't remember the guy's, what? Potiphar? Is Potiphar? Oh, yeah, Potiphar. I had Pharaoh in my head. Potiphar. And so he's doing the best he can as sort of a house servant. And one day, Potiphar's wife, she's got the hots for him. And one day she makes a play for him, and he runs. This is his nightmare. He don't want to do that. And he says to her, "How could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? Your master has entrusted me with everything." And he flees, which was a good idea. But when the master comes home, she accuses him of sexual assault. And Potiphar believes her and sends him to the Pharaoh's prison. Now, think about the downward steps that this guy's taken. He's in a home, and his brothers think he's nuts, and he had some of this coming. But he's thrown down a well to die. He's sold by his brothers into slavery. He becomes a slave. He does the best he can in Potiphar's house, and then gets falsely accused of a crime, sexual assault, and is in prison. Now, if there's anybody that has a work environment that's worse than that, then you might be able to ignore what we're going to see in his example. But he did not check out at work. He did not just do the minimum, clock in, clock out in the prison. He didn't just sit back and just cool his heels and just be a prisoner. Verse 19 in Genesis 39. When his master heard the story, his wife told him, saying, "This is how your slave treated me." He burned with anger. Joseph's master took him, put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. And 2 times in this passage, the writer uses that little preposition "with." At the beginning of this little passage, the end of this little passage, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. And then something happens here between the end of this verse and the next verse. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was responsible for all that was done there. So the Lord gives him favor, shows him kindness, and apparently he went to the manager at Ward's warehouse and said, "What can I do to help here?" And the warden had some ideas. And Joseph put his hand to the plow to do what he could. And over time, he had influence in this man's life, in the warden. So the warden gave him a promotion, so to speak, put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison. He was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. There was no need for the warden to check back or to get feedback or to, did you get done what you were to do? When I was helping to start Hope Church back in Fort Worth with Harold, I was an employee. I was on the staff. And my dad was a very successful CEO of a company. And one day he challenged me. He said, whenever Harold gives you an assignment, you have got to make sure you get that assignment done. Every time. Every time. And when you walk into that meeting, whether it's your personal meeting with the boss or a group staff meeting, every time you want to have your assignment done. Every time. He said, I tell the people that work for me that if you can't get your assignment done before our meeting, I want you to come in before the meeting and let me know. I do not want to find out this information in the meeting, and especially in a meeting with other people together. I remember thinking, wow, I have really got to up my game here. And this is when I think I learned how to use a calendar for the first time. And I remember writing down all my assignments and my little thing of check back and trying to get that done. Well, apparently Joseph didn't have a calendar and didn't have to write anything down. He was that kind of person. If he said he was going to do it, it was going to get done. And the warden didn't have to wonder, oh, what's going to happen, you know. Now, things happen occasionally. We get derailed. But as a way of life, this is how he worked in the prison. Now, we talked about his relationship with God. The Lord was with him. And because there was some sense in which he knew that was true, this motivated him in that awful situation. And how did he approach his work? He approached his work as if this was God's assignment. This was his new sphere of influence that he never would have chosen on his own. But he was with the prisoners and the warden a lot. And how did he influence the warden? He influenced the warden by how he worked and why he worked. Now, when I think about this with Joseph here, I want to just ask you to personalize this. In your work world, what would a fly on the wall see about you in your 40 or 50 hours a week? How would they observe you? Why you work? How you work? Who you work for? And I wonder, the things that are coming to mind now, are these the things that can up your game in spheres of influence? How we talk about our work, how we talk about the boss, how we talk about the people we work with. All of these have a profound influence on the people around them. I mentioned earlier that taking an interest in people is probably the easiest way that for most people, somebody had influence in your life and they cared about you. And I'm always amazed at how, for some people, when I hear their story, their career choice ended up because of somebody that influenced them. Or they recognized their strengths for the first time because somebody else recognized their strengths. Or they helped get confidence because somebody else had confidence in them. Or they realized that their life mattered. Or that maybe you took an interest in God or the Bible for the first time because of somebody's influence. Sometimes this can be very, very simple stuff. When I was a grad student at the seminary, I'd only been a Christian for about 2.5 years. And one of the fellows that came in a first-year student, as I was a second-year student, was a fellow named John. And I don't remember why this happened, but I made this guy, ready, a plate of brownies. And he survived. And over the years, and that began a mentoring relationship, little brownies. And over the years, periodically he calls me or texts me. I got a text over Christmas. How brownies made a difference for him. Something as simple as that. I have another friend of mine that started about the same time. His name is Ralph. And Ralph came from a very, very well-known pastor family in Houston. And Ralph had gone to a Christian school. And when I first met Ralph, I felt like I'm kind of like Barney Fife spiritually compared to what Ralph grew up in, the church he grew up in, and his father's influence in his life. What I did not know was that when Ralph came to school, he was pretty banged up personally. He was pretty broken. And I don't remember what it was. I think I might have made him chocolate chip cookies. That rings a bell. And that began a mentoring relationship that I did not see coming at all. I just assumed that he was light years ahead of me spiritually. But he needed my role in his life. He didn't know how to have a quiet time. He didn't know how to pray. Didn't know how to share his testimony. Didn't know how to share the simple gospel. He'd never heard the concept of serving as a way of life. There were a bunch of things like this that even though he'd grown up in a great church and a great church family and a personal family, he had none of this. And my life, even as a fledgling 2.5-year-old Christian, made a significant difference with my friend Ralph. And it all started with, I think it was a plate of cookies. I'll see Ralph pretty soon again. I'll have to ask him if he remembers that. Well, let's wrap this up. This kind of influence, I'm not talking about professional influence. I'm not talking about the great things that you know in your work field that other people can do. There's a place for that. But this kind of influence is personal influence, relational influence. It usually starts with taking an interest in somebody, caring about somebody, and beginning a relationship beyond just your everyday weather and sports kind of thing. Hey, tell me about your family growing up. What was that like? What was your school like? What were you interested in when you went to school? Were you a sports person, music person? You get a relationship going of care, and it's amazing how just simple things like this can begin the process of influence. As we close, I want you to think about who? Who are some people in your life, in your spheres of work particularly, that maybe God wants you there to make an influence with them? Let's pray together. Father, I thank you for the people that made an influence in my life. Some of them were fairly small things, probably from their point of view. Coaches, teachers, a mentor, several professors at school. that affected my life, affected who I am today, affected the man I aspire to still be. And in this room, and maybe over the internet, you desire to use the people in this room and over the internet in their spheres of influence as they take an interest in people, care about people, begin deeper relationships with people. And for some of these people, they are going to be influenced through things as simple as that, along with a plate of cookies and maybe a plate of brownies, some flowers, a little flower arrangement. Father, lay these people on our hearts and help us to see the opportunities that you give us.